Expedia and Visit Scotland invite you to come experience the beauty that awaits in Scotland. The sweep of wild coastlines, quiet lochs, and untamed landscapes. Fresh cuisine that feels rooted in the land. Come experience the kind of stillness that stays with you long after you leave. Plan your Scottish escape today at expedia.com/Visit Scotland.
Ready to soundtrack your summer? With Red Bull Summer All Day Play, you choose a playlist that fits your summer vibe the best. Are you a festival fanatic, a deep end DJ, a road dog, or a trail mixer? Just add a song to your chosen playlist and put your summer on track. Red Bull Summer All Day Play. Red Bull gives you wings. Visit redbull.com/brightsummer ahead to learn more. See you this summer.
You're listening to Unbound presents Until They Wake. 7 episodes, 6 lives, 1 impossible convergence. Beth Curry's been chasing these stories for a while now, and she's finally ready to share what she found. It's not what you'd expect. Nothing about this is. Pull up a chair. This one's different.
Hey there, welcome back. I'm Beth Curry, and you're listening to Until They Wake. We're on day 5. 5 stories, 5 people. James Cooper in 95, Ruth Mitchell in 87, Maria Gonzalez in 2001, Danny Walsh in 1976. Today's story is different from the others because with James and Ruth and Maria and Danny, the danger came from outside, an accident, an attack, a fall. But the person I'm going to tell you about today, the danger came from inside, from in his own mind, and from a decision made on a bathroom floor in Minneapolis on a November night in 1992. This is a story about Bill Harrison, and it's about depression and survival and the long kind of ongoing work of learning to live with a mind that sometimes wants you gone. I want to say before we get into it, if you're in a dark place right now, please reach out to somebody. You don't need to listen to this episode. You can still, listen to future episodes where I tell you how all of these stories are connected. This story has a lot of hope in it, but I know that it's hard to see when you're in the middle of the hard part. So you can walk away from this. Bill Harrison was 17 the first time he tried to end his life. It was clumsy. It was dramatic. It was probably more a cry for help than a genuine desire to die. He found pills in his mom's medicine cabinet. It wasn't enough to do real damage. And he woke up in the hospital with his stomach pumped and his mom crying and a psychiatrist asking him questions he didn't know how to answer. Why? Why did you do it? William, why? He didn't have an answer then. He wouldn't really, even just years later, he still doesn't. It was just a feeling that the world was too much and he was too little and nothing would ever be okay. Back then, they kept him for 72 hours under observation. And when they let him go, his mom watched him like he was made of glass. As a mom, I get it. Maybe she was right. So by 1992, Bill was 34 years old, and he'd been managing his depression for half his life. Some years were better than others, and some days he woke up and felt almost normal, but other days he could barely get out of bed. He worked as an accountant at a mid-sized firm in Minneapolis. Numbers made sense to him in a way that people didn't. They were predictable and logical and clean, and you can't misinterpret a spreadsheet. His apartment was small and neat and tidy. Everything was in its place, and he lived alone. He had for years. He tried the roommate thing in his 20s, but it was too hard to hide the bad days, and it was too exhausting to pretend he was okay when he wasn't. His mom called him frequently. She lived 2 hours away in the house where Bill grew up. His dad left when Bill was 12, just walked out and never came back. She never remarried. She kind of poured everything into Bill instead, which to him, he says, felt like love and suffocation all mixed together. Every week, the same questions. Are you taking your meds? Are you eating properly? And the same reassurances every time. She was terrified of getting a call that said this time was different, Bill thought about it, of course, more times than he could count. Bad days when the weight of existing felt unbearable, when getting up and getting dressed and going to work felt like climbing a mountain with no peak. But he didn't act on it because he'd promised her he wouldn't. And because he was on medication that mostly worked. He had a therapist he saw every other week who gave him tools for coping. Because somewhere buried under all the heaviness, there was a part of him that wanted to stay. He didn't have many friends, he said. A few guys from work he'd grab lunch with sometimes. There's a woman named Karen in his building who brought him soup when he was sick, and the regulars at the coffee shop who knew his order. It wasn't much of a life, but it was his, and he was fine with it. He said that the firm was busy, tax planning season especially. He would work late most nights. The office would be quieter, peaceful, just the hum of the computers and the glow of desk lamps. His supervisor, Janet, worried about him. She would tell him he needed to have a life outside of work. But work was easier than life. Work had structure and deadlines and clear objectives. He had been seeing a new therapist for several months at that point. He said she was a woman in her 50s. She had kind eyes and kind of a no-nonsense approach, and she had been pushing him to engage more with the world and make connections and try new things and stop hiding in his apartment and in his spreadsheets. Depression wants you isolated, she would say, It wants you small and alone. Don't let it win. So Bill had been trying. He joined a gym, though he rarely went. He would say yes to a few work happy hours and stuff like that. He actually said he started volunteering at a food bank on Saturday mornings. These were kind of the small steps toward a life worth living. At least that's what his doctor said, his therapist. So September was always hard. Something about the changing season and the light getting shorter, the year winding down. Bill said he could feel the depression kind of creeping back in. He said the heaviness settling over everything was very familiar to him. He started going to therapy a little bit more. He started making sure he was taking his medication at the same time every day. He did all the things he was supposed to do. And most days it helped, but some days it didn't. November 8th, 1992, it was a Sunday night. He had said it was a bad week. It was a bad month. It was one of those stretches where the meds didn't seem to be working and therapy kind of felt pointless, and getting out of bed was an accomplishment. But he said he couldn't quite handle it. He'd called in sick to work 3 times. He canceled his therapy appointments. He stopped answering his mom's calls. And the isolation felt kind of terrible and necessary, both at the same time. Like he was protecting everyone from the worst parts of him. That Saturday, he had stayed in bed all day. He said he didn't eat. He barely drank water. He just stared at the ceiling and thought about how tired he was. Not really physically tired, though he was that too. He said he was soul tired. He was exhausted by the effort of existing. Sunday morning, his mom showed up at his apartment, and she let herself in with the spare key he'd given her for emergencies. Her voice was sharp with worry, She made him shower, and she made him eat, and sat with him on the couch and held his hand like he was still a child. She said she was going to call the doctor in the morning and that they'd figure it out. She left around 6, and she made him promise to call her before bed, and made him promise that he would eat dinner, and made him promise he'd be okay, and he promised. After she left, the apartment felt too quiet, and the walls kind of pressed in, and his thoughts spiraled. He thought about calling the doctor's emergency line and maybe calling 911. He thought about going to the hospital. But at around 11, he went into the bathroom instead, and he pulled out the 30 pills in his prescription bottle from the cabinet. It was a month's supply he'd just refilled, and he poured them into his palm and sat down on the bathroom floor with his back against the cold tile. He said this is what depression does, it narrows your world until there's no room for hope, until the worst option starts to look like the only one. He took the first pill and then the second, and then he stopped. And he thought about his mom finding him and the look on her face and the guilt she'd carry for the rest of her life. And he took the third and then the fourth, and his hands were shaking. And he doesn't remember the rest clearly. The slow fade, just lying down on the floor, the cold tiles against his cheek. His mom had gotten worried when she didn't get a call from him, and she drove back over and she used her key and she called 911. They found him in time and they pumped his stomach. Again, no permanent damage, but when Bill woke up, his mother was there. Our face tear-stained and terrified, saying thank God over and over. The doctor told him they'd gotten to him fast enough and that he was going to be okay. And once again, Bill was in the psych unit for 2 weeks. New medication, more intensive therapy. There was safety planning. There was learning to recognize the warning signs before they became a crisis. His mom came every day now, made him promise again. And this time in the hospital bed, he meant it in a way that he really hadn't before. And the years after that night are divided into before or after, he said. The new medication worked better. The therapy helped. He developed strategies and support systems and ways of coping that actually held. He moved to a different apartment, one without the same memories, and he started going to a support group for people with depression. He found something in shared struggle that he hadn't been able to find anywhere else. And people would say it gets better, and slowly and incrementally, he says it did. It wasn't perfect or cured, but he was better. He changed jobs and he moved to a smaller firm with a better work-life balance. He says he made actual friends, people who knew about his depression and checked in on him on bad days, and they didn't treat him like he was fragile. And in the late 90s, he started dating. Nothing serious, he says, but just enough to remind him he could connect with people, and he wasn't as isolated as depression wanted him to believe. In 2000, he met Rebecca. She's a teacher, patient and understanding when he told her about his history, and they dated for 2 years before Bill realized he couldn't give her what she needed. And that part of him was still too guarded and too afraid. And she told him that she loved him, but that she didn't think he loved himself yet. And she was right. Bill threw himself back into therapy. He did the hard work of unpacking childhood trauma and perfectionism and the impossible standards he'd spent his whole life measuring himself against. He learned that depression was something he'd always managed, not something he'd ever fully defeat. His mother got older, her heart started giving her trouble too. Bill visited her more often and took on more of her care, and she'd tell him he was a good son, and he'd tell her she was a good mom. The years kind of accumulated. Some were good, some were hard. There were medication adjustments and therapy tweaks and ongoing work of staying stable. Bill said he was okay. He wasn't exactly happy, but he was functional, and he was present, and he was alive. In late October 2015, Bill got a call from an old friend from the support group, Marcus. They had lost touch over the years, but Marcus had tracked down his number somehow. He was in a rough spot, wondered if they could talk. Of course, Bill said yes, and that's what you do, when you know the darkness, you show up. They met for coffee a few times. Marcus was going through a divorce and dealing with suicidal thoughts, feeling like he was back at square one. Bill says that Marcus said it didn't feel like it gets better and that everyone says it does, but he just couldn't see it. And Bill told him it does, not all at once, but it does. And then on November 7th, almost exactly 23 years after Bill's own night on the bathroom floor, Marcus didn't show up for their coffee, and he didn't answer his phone. Bill had a bad feeling, the kind that comes from knowing the darkness too well, and he drove to Marcus's apartment, and he knocked, and there was no answer. He convinced the building manager to do a wellness check, and they found Marcus unconscious, and they rushed him to the nearest hospital with a psych unit. Bill followed in his car. He called Marcus's sister, and he waited in the emergency room while they worked on him. Marcus made it. They stabilized him and admitted him to the psych ward. Bill asked if he could see him. Family only, they said. Come back tomorrow during visiting hours. Bill stayed anyway. He says he sat in the waiting room with terrible coffee, thinking about his own bathroom floor and about second chances, about how much work it took to get from that night to this one and how it had been worth every hard step. Around midnight, he got up to walk and clear his head. The hospital was quiet. He walked without much purpose, past closed doors and through dim corridors. At some point, he says he took a wrong turn and ended up somewhere he didn't recognize. He thought it was an older part of the building. He expected people to be there, or at least people stopping him from being there, but it didn't happen. So he stood there for a second, not really quite sure which way he'd come from, and then just turned around and retraced his steps till the corridor started looking familiar again. And he found the exit, stepped outside and took a deep breath in and sat on a bench for a while. And then he went back inside to wait for the morning. This is Bill Harrison, November 1992, a bathroom floor, Minneapolis. 23 years of recovery, of showing up for other people, of learning to live with a mind that sometimes wanted him gone. If anything in Bill's story sounds familiar, if you're carrying something heavy right now, please reach out to someone. You don't have to be in crisis to do so. You just have to be struggling. Tomorrow's the final story, 2008, a plane and 187 passengers who didn't all make it home. See you then.
That's it for this episode of Until They Wake. Unbound is free to listen to. If you'd like to support production costs or get in touch with Beth, check the show notes for details. See you next time.